Considering the flack they get online, it can be hard to understand why companies like IGN or Gamespot even existed in the first place. In the end, it's really a history lesson that's needed to be able to understand why they're around. The video game landscape before modern games journalism looked very different. Games were created en masse for relatively cheap. There was not much quality control. This was before the kind of Nintendo seal of quality. Consumer confidence was extremely low. Things were just kind of pushed out onto the market for relatively easy profit. Around then, games were sold for pretty similar price, around $40 or so each. And that ended up being, adjusted for inflation, about $100 of today's money. So these games that were sold with very little understanding of what the actual gameplay might have looked like, people could profit very easily off of just really crappy games. That isn't to say that all the games around this time were crappy. We had, our hits and classics, but there was no incentive to, grow in the genre because you could make just as much money just pushing something out. This is before what many would call the golden era of gaming, before Nintendo really came out onto the scene in the United States. And most infamously during this time was the creation of Pac-Man for the Atari and E.T. for the Atari. These games were created in such high quantities, expecting that people would buy them, that there was a surplus. Nobody wanted them, and there was quite an overstock. The games, generally okay for the time period. E.T. was mocked probably the most out of these, but they ended up being dumped in a landfill. You can probably find some documentary on YouTube about it, but it just kind of goes to show with the environment. Consumer trust was so low in video games that nobody cared. We had a market that went from, $3 billion down to a market of only $100 million. It's a 97% crash. This was unprecedented. So what was anybody going to do about it? The solution on the business end was to create companies like Nintendo that basically claimed, we make quality games so you can trust us. They have a Nintendo seal of approval. Even their third-party developers would have to go through some sort of vetting process in order for any of their games to even be published on their platform. But consumers aren't so easily convinced, and that's where the modern video game review emerged. Pretty early on after the release of the NES in America, about 3 years later in 1987, we saw the release of Nintendo Power, a magazine that was published by Nintendo, but had reviews of major games releasing on their platforms. It put a little kind of standard in what was a good game. There were others before that, but I think that's it shows the timeline of all these developments. So there we have a kind of clear line of where these video game reviews come from. We have games that didn't meet a minimum quality standard, and so we needed some sort of consumer reaction to it. In a way, it was almost a unionization of, gamers saying, hey, we're not going to buy your game unless somebody can attest to the quality. You see kind of movements like this still around. People who say don't pre-order games kind of comes from the same strain. This whole idea of, no, we should wait for reviewers because reviewers are these kind of trusted middlemen to be able to take a game, tell us if it's good or not, and then consumers can buy it or not. We can still see this in the structure of video game reviews today. Talking about stuff like, what's the quality of the graphics? How good the sound is? These kind of basic measures of, really basic quality. You'll see a lot of baseline, how is the gameplay? How is this? How is that? And not a very intense critique in general. I don't really blame all these companies and all these creators kind of sticking to the same formula because there's a reason it's here. When people are threatened by stuff like microtransactions still, we need a place to be able to fall back on reviewers to say, hey, are these games going to try to take advantage of consumers? I guess there isn't a growth in video game reviews like there has been in other genres. It's kind of stuck on this kind of middling consumer era. But that's a talk for another video. I think I'm going to stop for here, but thank you all for watching and kind of hearing my little history lesson. And I hope to see you next Saturday.